1 quadrillion guardsmen. That is the real cost of war in the 41st millennium. It is not a guess. It is not an exaggeration. It is the truth the Imperium refuses to record, because it does not care. The Siege of Vraks alone saw 100 million guardsmen thrown into the trenches, ground into dust over 17 years. The Sabbath World's crusade devoured billions of soldiers, entire regiments erased from history before their names could even be recorded. The wars for Armageddon saw hundreds of billions fed into the meat grinder, a death toll so great that entire hive worlds had to be emptied just to replenish the ranks. And then there are the Tyranid Wars, where numbers become meaningless. Planets deploying billions of guardsmen at a time, only for them to be consumed within days. If you were to try to count them all, if you were to add up every battle, every campaign, every war fought in the name of the Emperor, you would reach an unfathomable truth. Over 1 quadrillion guardsmen have died, and that number grows every single day. There is no count, just an estimation. No grand ledger because you are not missed. No carefully kept registry that tallies the names of the fallen in the name of the Imperium. In the endless war that defines the Imperium of man, there is only the machine, vast, indifferent, and insatiable. It consumes, it measures what it needs, not what it spends. It does not pause to mourn. It does not falter in the face of loss. It grinds forward, an unrelenting mechanism powered by flesh, steel, and the unshakable belief that humanity must endure at any cost. The Astra Militarum, known colloquially as the Imperial Guard, is not a professional army in the way that we, in our limited understanding, might conceive one. It is not a specialized force of elites, honed and perfected for surgical strikes. It is a hammer. A brutal, bludgeoning instrument wielded by a god emperor who has long since fallen silent. And like any hammer, it does not care how many times it must be swung, nor how many times it must break before its wielder's will is done. The numbers are incomprehensible. Across 1 million worlds, recruitment never ceases. Hive cities churn out regiments by the millions, scouring their lower depths for men and women whose existence means nothing except as fuel for the great furnace of war. Agri-worlds send their second sons and third daughters, giving their surplus to the front lines. Feral and feudal societies tithe their warriors in blood, their tribal champions reduced to mere soldiers in a force so large that even a single battle might swallow entire populations whole. There are no singular heroes in the Astra Militarum, not in the way the Astartes are lauded, nor in the way inquisitors or rogue traders carve their names into history. There is only the mass, the tidal wave of human life thrown against the horrors of the galaxy in an unending surge. Some regiments become known, their deeds etched into the annals of the Administratum, but even they are only remembered in broad strokes. The Death Corps of Krieg, the Cadian Shock Troopers, the Catachan Jungle Fighters, each a name, a uniform, an identity. But within those units, the individual is dust. They exist only as part of the whole, one replaceable element in an endless supply. But to ask how many guardsmen have died is to ask how many drops of water have fallen in a storm. The question itself borders on irrelevance in the eyes of the Imperium's bureaucrats, who do not count the dead, but measure battles in percentages, victories in sectors reclaimed, and losses in terms of planetary populations. Death is not an anomaly. It is not a failure. It is the inevitable, expected, and wholly accepted outcome of war. Yet the sheer scale of the loss cannot be ignored. If one were to try and grasp it, even for a moment, the numbers would stagger the mind. The Guard is not an army that sustains thousands of casualties per battle. It is an army that bleeds millions in the span of a single campaign, that loses entire worlds' worth of soldiers in the span of a year, that does not stop fighting even when logic and sanity would demand it. There is no peace. There is no end. And so long as the Imperium endures, so too will its hammer continue to fall. The Administratum does not count the dead. It does not record names, nor does it track the lives spent across the endless frontiers of war. It is concerned only with the numbers that matter: troop movements, supply lines, requisition orders. A regiment lost is not a tragedy. It is a logistical inconvenience, a column in a vast table that simply needs adjusting. And so, when one asks how many guardsmen have died, the question is met with silence. Not because the answer is unknown, but because it is irrelevant to the machine of war. There is always more. More soldiers, more bodies, more worlds to draw from. The Imperium does not falter in the face of its losses. It simply replaces them. But what is the scale? A single regiment, numbering tens of thousands, might be obliterated in a day. A planetary defense force, raised in the millions, might be reduced to ash in a month. The fall of a single hive city, caught in the throes of war, might claim billions. The sheer immensity of the Imperium means that no loss is ever truly beyond replacement. For every guardsman who perishes, 10 more are born across 1 million worlds, and the war machine grinds ever forward. There are wars where victory is measured not in battles won, but in bodies spent. The Siege of Vraks dragged on for 17 years, consuming over 14 million guardsmen before the heretical stronghold was broken. The Sabbat World's Crusade, a campaign lasting decades, devoured entire regiments without hesitation, with planets changing hands over and over, each battle scarring the land with the blood of the fallen. And then there are the Tyranid Wars, wars where numbers become meaningless, where entire sectors are lost, and where the Imperium is forced to feed its soldiers into the grinder just to slow the inevitable advance. The Fourth Tyrannic War alone has seen the deployment of billions of guardsmen, none of whom will return, for against the Great Devourer, there is no retreat, no mercy, no survival. There are worlds where the dead outnumber the living, where the soil is richer in human remains than in nutrients. There are campaigns that have lasted centuries, grinding down generation after generation of warriors, until even the memories of those who first fought have faded into dust. And through it all, the Astra Militarum continues to march forward, never stopping, never breaking, because it cannot. The scale of the sacrifice is beyond human comprehension. It is beyond grief. It is beyond mourning. It is simply war. War in the 41st millennium is not fought in the way we might imagine. It is not a series of strategic battles, cleanly planned and neatly executed. It is not a contest between forces of equal strength, maneuvering for tactical advantage. It is an apocalypse given form, an eternal tide of destruction in which human lives are spent like currency, recklessly, thoughtlessly, because there is no alternative. Across thousands of battlefields, the Astra Militarum has bled to hold the Imperium together, to reclaim lost worlds, to buy time for greater forces to act. But some wars, some campaigns, stand as monuments to the sheer magnitude of human sacrifice. They are remembered not for their victories, nor even for their defeats, but for the unthinkable numbers of guardsmen they consumed. The Astra Militarum does not count its dead. The Imperium does not mourn them. There is no tally, no monument, no name etched in history for the billions who perish each day. To ask how many guardsmen have died is to ask how many raindrops have fallen in a storm, how many grains of sand make up a desert. The answer is beyond reason, beyond measure, beyond comprehension. And yet, if one were to attempt to grasp it, to truly understand the cost, then the answer would not be measured in millions, nor even in billions. The true number of dead stretches into the trillions, perhaps even the quadrillions. It is a number so vast that it ceases to have meaning, so immense that even the administratum, a bureaucracy built upon record-keeping, has long since given up trying to track it. The Imperium does not track the fallen, it only tracks the replacements. The Guard is not a professional military force in the way modern minds might conceive it. It is not a limited or specialized army, carefully trained and deployed with precision. It is a flood, an unstoppable tide of human life hurled at the enemies of mankind without hesitation or regard for cost. And because the Imperium is beyond vast, spanning over 1 million worlds, that flood is never ending. Every hive world produces billions of recruits every year, filling transport ships with fresh regiments faster than they can even be armed. Entire civilizations are emptied, their people thrown into the war machine that does not slow, does not stop, does not care. The Guard does not suffer thousands of casualties in a battle. It does not even suffer millions. It suffers entire planetary populations worth of dead in a single campaign. It fights wars that last not for years, not for decades, but for centuries. And in each of them, the price is paid in human lives at a scale that defies imagination. The Siege of Vraks alone, a war of attrition fought against traitors, lasted for 17 years. The Death Corps of Krieg, an army raised to embrace death as a necessity, were deployed in such overwhelming numbers that their own commanders had no expectation of survival. The battlefields of Vraks became an open graveyard, the very trenches filled with the bodies of the fallen, as wave after wave of guardsmen charged into the guns of the enemy, knowing they would not return. By the time the war was over 100 million guardsmen lay dead, their sacrifice spent just to grind a single world back into the Imperium's grasp. But that was one war on one planet. The Sabbat World's Crusade, a multi-decade campaign against the forces of chaos, consumed entire star systems in its bloodletting. World after world was reclaimed at a cost so great that even the Imperium itself struggled to maintain pace with the losses. Every planet liberated came at the cost of another billion guardsmen. Some regiments were deployed, fought, and erased within the span of weeks, their banners lost, their names forgotten, their very existence erased from the record, not because they had been reassigned, but because they had been utterly annihilated. And even these legendary campaigns pale in comparison to the true horrors of the galaxy. The wars for Armageddon were apocalyptic in scale, seeing the Imperium commit hundreds of billions of guardsmen into the inferno. The First War, a brutal clash against chaos, saw guardsmen stand against the armies of the Dark Gods at a cost so staggering that it was never officially recorded. The Second and Third Wars, against the unstoppable tides of orcs under Gazkul Mag Uruk Thraka, saw casualties beyond reckoning. The fighting was so brutal that millions died every single day, entire regiments being wiped from existence before they could even report their losses. And yet, despite all of it, despite the oceans of blood spilled, the war never truly ended. The orcs still infest the ruins, still wage their eternal battle, and so the Imperium maintains a permanent garrison of guardsmen, a force that will never leave, never know another home, never live beyond the trenches they were sent to die in. And then there are the Tyranid Wars, conflicts so vast, so utterly apocalyptic, that even the Imperium itself struggles to comprehend their scale. The Fourth Tyrannic War alone has seen the Imperium throw entire sectors of space into the meat grinder. A single hive fleet does not simply attack a world, it devours it whole, reducing its cities to rubble, stripping its biosphere of all organic life, leaving nothing behind but a lifeless husk. Against this impossible enemy, the Astra Militarum does not fight to win. It fights to slow the inevitable. Planet after planet is sacrificed, billions of guardsmen erased from existence within days, all to buy a few more hours, a few more days before the Tyranids reach the next world. And what is the final tally of this? How many guardsmen have died across the millennia? The Imperium does not have an answer, it never will. But if one were to estimate, if one were to grasp the scale of human loss across 10,000 years of unending war, the answer would stretch into impossible numbers. The dead are not counted in millions, they are not counted in billions. The dead of the Astra Militarum are counted in the trillions, perhaps even the quadrillions. A single battle costs millions of lives. A single campaign wipes out billions. A galactic war consumes entire populations. The true number of dead guardsmen, no one knows. But what is certain is this: the number will never stop growing. The Imperium does not pause. It does not reflect. It does not mourn. It only marches forward, its soldiers replaced before their bodies have cooled, their names erased before they are even spoken. Because as long as the Imperium endures, as long as there are planets to raise soldiers and wars to be fought, as long as the galaxy remains locked in eternal conflict, the Guard will never stop marching, because it cannot. Because in the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. And so, the Guard continues to march. A Guardsman's life is measured not in years, but in deployments, not in achievements, but in survival. And for most, survival is a fleeting thing. The Astra Militarum is a force defined by its sheer numbers, but behind those faceless masses are individuals, each with a name, a homeworld, a past that will never be recorded. A Guardsman is not a machine, not an automaton that marches to war without fear or hesitation. They are human, and the wars they fight in are beyond human comprehension. They are thrown into conflicts that do not care for their existence. Worlds where the air itself is poison, where the enemy is something that should not be. Demons that defy reality, xenos monstrosities that consume without reason, traitors who look like them, speak like them, but have long since abandoned their humanity. They are given a laser gun, a flak vest that might stop a solid slug, but will do nothing against the horrors they face, and they are told to fight. Most do, some don't. The ones who hesitate, who break, who run, they die just the same. If not by the enemy, then by the commissar's bolt pistol. There is no room for doubt, no room for fear. The Imperium does not abide weakness. And yet, even among those who stand their ground, who do everything asked of them, death is not an outcome. It is an expectation. A guardsman might survive one battle, two, maybe an entire campaign if the Emperor wills it. But the Astra Militarum does not grant retirement. There is no homecoming, no return to the lives they once knew. Once they are conscripted, they march until they can march no longer. And when that day comes, when the battlefield finally claims them, there will be no one to remember. Their bodies will be left where they fall, unmarked and unburied, because there is no time, no resources, and no reason to do otherwise. Their names will be forgotten because the administratum does not track the fallen, only the reinforcements that replace them. There is no glory in the Astra Militarum, no hero's welcome. The greatest honor a guardsman can achieve is to die in a way that means something, to be one more body in the pile that holds the line for just a little longer. But does it mean anything? Does a death truly have weight when it is one of millions? When entire regiments vanish in a single engagement, their sacrifice unnoticed, unrecorded, unremembered. When the Imperium throws lives into the fire knowing full well that it does not matter, so long as more can take their place. Perhaps in the moment, to those who stand beside them, it does. The brotherhood of the trenches, the shared horror, the knowledge that the man to your left and right is all you have, that is real. That is human. But the Imperium is not human. It is a machine, and in its endless grinding gears, a single guardsman's life is a thing of no consequence. And yet, despite it all, they fight. They fight because they must. Because if they do not, someone else will. Because the universe will not stop to pity them, and the Imperium cannot afford to care. Because in the end, there is no choice. There is only war. And war does not care for the human cost. A guardsman does not enter the battlefield whole, not truly. From the moment they are conscripted, shipped away from their homeworld, and thrust into the war machine of the Imperium, they begin to erode. They are trained, yes, drilled in formation, in the use of a laser gun, in the proper ways to charge or hold a trench, in how to die correctly. But training does not prepare them for what awaits. It does not prepare them for the sheer, inhuman reality of war in the 41st millennium. No one is ready for their first battle. The noise alone is enough to shatter the mind. The roar of artillery never stops, the sky turned to fire and smoke, the ground itself shaking as ordnance tears it apart. The screams of the dying blend into the static of Vox transmissions, the barked orders of officers drowned in the chaos. And then there is the enemy, never what they expected, always worse than they could have imagined. They do not fight men, they fight monsters. The chitinous, churning tides of the Tyranids, mindless and relentless, a nightmare with no end. The gibbering, laughing horrors of chaos, their very presence an infection of the mind, twisting reality itself into something that defies sanity. The orcs, roaring and joyous, reveling in slaughter, their brutality so overwhelming that resistance feels like an absurdity. The Necrons, marching without emotion, without hesitation, without the frailties of flesh. And against these foes, what is a guardsman? Nothing. A human with a laser gun, a body in a uniform, a fraction of an army so vast that even if their entire regiment were erased in an instant, the war would go on exactly the same. They know this, they understand it, and it breaks them. Some are shattered in their first engagement. Some last longer, enduring battle after battle until something inside them, something crucial, simply stops functioning. They do not scream. They do not run. They fight, because that is all there is left. But there is no fire in them anymore. No hope, no thought of victory. They are the walking dead, waiting for the moment when a stray round or a Xeno's claw, or the maw of something not of this reality finally ends them. Those who survive too long are often the most dangerous. They are the ones who no longer fear death, the ones who no longer hesitate to march into the worst of it, because the difference between life and death has ceased to matter. Commissars rarely need to execute veterans. By that point, the survivors are the ones who have accepted the truth that they are already dead. There are stories, of course. Legends of guardsmen who stand against impossible odds, of last stands that echo across the stars, of regiments that fight until the last man falls. But those are stories for the living. The dead do not care for them. And the Imperium? The Imperium does not care at all. It does not send psychologists to its soldiers. It does not offer comfort. It does not treat trauma. The moment a guardsman becomes too broken to function, they are left behind, discarded like spent ammunition. If they are lucky, they are sent into a charge that will end their suffering quickly. If not, they are reassigned to the worst battlefields, places where even the dead might envy those still fighting. Some take their own way out. Some break, their minds unraveling beyond repair, screaming in tongues that do not belong to humanity. Some vanish into the night, slipping away into the ruins, their fate unknown. It does not matter. The Astra Militarum does not count the lost. It only counts those who can still fight. And the war never ends. The Imperium does not weep for its dead. It does not mourn the fallen, nor does it pause to reflect on the horror endured by those who still march beneath its banners. It cannot afford to. War is all-consuming, an ever-hungry engine that demands a constant supply of bodies and blood. To stop, even for a moment, is to invite collapse. And so, the Astra Militarum is sustained not through care, but through control. Through an endless, self-perpetuating system that ensures the Guard will always have fresh soldiers, always have replacements, always have more to throw into the abyss. The process begins long before a Guardsman is ever deployed. Tithes are extracted from every world under the Imperium's rule, a demand for soldiers that cannot be refused. It does not matter if a world is newly colonized, if it is in crisis, if it can barely sustain its own people, the Guard must be replenished. Some worlds send their best, others send their worst. Some provide trained militias, well-equipped and disciplined. Others empty their prisons, handing rifles to criminals and exiles, using war itself as a means of population control. Once conscripted, a soldier's life is no longer their own. Training is swift, brutal, and impersonal. They are not taught to be great warriors. They are taught to obey, to stand their ground, to hold a line, no matter what comes for them. Fear is an enemy that must be eradicated, and so the Imperium enforces discipline with absolute severity. Commissars are embedded within every regiment, their presence a constant looming reminder that hesitation is death, not only at the hands of the enemy, but by the bolt pistol of their own command. A single step backward in retreat is an execution offence. A moment's doubt is treason. Any soldier who refuses to fight, who flinches when they should charge, who shows weakness when resolve is required, they are made an example of. But fear alone is not enough to sustain an army. The Imperium understands this, and so it offers something else: belief. Every guardsman is told that their duty is sacred, that they do not fight merely for survival, nor for glory, nor even for victory, but for the Emperor himself. To die in his name is the highest honor, the ultimate sacrifice. Propaganda reinforces this at every turn. Soldiers are made to chant prayers before battle, their minds filled with the certainty that the Emperor watches over them, that their deaths are not meaningless, that they are part of something greater. Some believe it, many do not. But in the moment, when the order is given to charge, when the enemy stands before them, when there is no escape and no chance of survival, faith is all that remains. And for those who break, for those who survive too long, who grow hollow and weary, who see through the lie but have nowhere left to go, they are repurposed. Some are sent into penal legions, given one last chance to redeem themselves by charging into certain death. Others are reassigned to suicide missions, disposable assets for objectives deemed impossible. Some are simply left behind, abandoned on dying worlds with nothing but their weapons and the knowledge that their war will never end. There is no mercy in the Imperium, no kindness. The Guard is not meant to be sustained by compassion, nor by hope. It is a machine. And as long as there are bodies to feed into it, as long as there are still planets left to recruit from, as long as there is one more soldier who can hold a rifle and stand in the line, it will never stop. The Astra Militarum does not remember its dead. There are no memorials, no great monuments carved in their honor. Their names are not recorded. Their deeds, no matter how desperate or heroic, are lost in the tide of time. The Imperium does not look back. It only marches forward, indifferent to the cost. And yet, that cost is incomprehensible. To ask how many Guardsmen have died is to ask how many grains of sand make up a desert, how many stars burn in the void. The answer is unknowable, not just because the records do not exist, but because the very scale of the Imperium defies human understanding. Wars are fought not in thousands, not in millions, but in billions. A single campaign can consume the population of entire worlds. A single decade can see entire sectors bled dry. And still, the Imperium does not falter. It cannot afford to. The dead are replaced before their bodies have cooled. Regiments are raised and deployed so quickly that many Guardsmen never even learn the names of those beside them before they are cut down. Wars last not for years, but for centuries, entire generations, knowing nothing but the fight. The cycle never ends, because it cannot end. The alternative is extinction. This is the grim truth of the 41st millennium. There is no peace, no rest, no reprieve. The Imperium survives only because it feeds itself to the fire. It bleeds and it burns, but it does not break. The Astra Militarum is its shield and its hammer, its tireless, faceless force that stands against an uncaring galaxy. It is not an army of heroes. It is not an army of individuals. It is a tide of humanity, a wave that crashes against the impossible, again and again and again. And as long as the Imperium endures, as long as there are planets to raise soldiers and wars to be fought, as long as the galaxy remains locked in eternal conflict, the Guard will never stop marching. It cannot, because in the end, there is only war.